I first started writing inevitably at school as part of my projects and always loved it. I think there was that point when I had the pen in my hand and the exercise book, and that gave me pleasure from a very early age.
I've been writing poetry ever since I knew how to write. The first poem that I wrote, I know I was 7 because it says age 7 1/4 in the book that I've written it in, and it has a little picture to go with it. Wrote hundreds of poems, I suppose, through my childhood, my teens, my 20s. So I guess I've always been writing poetry.
I started writing when I was quite a young child. I used to, even at primary school, I was writing poetry. And then by my early teens, I started onto short stories.
I started writing when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I just liked the idea of writing stories, and as soon as I could do it, really, I started.
I started writing probably when I was about 16 or 17. When I was in the 6th form at school, maybe a bit before, maybe when I was in the last year of the ordinary schooling, and I started writing just for a laugh, really, to amuse people, to amuse myself and to amuse other people. And maybe I wanted to shock as well, but shock for amusement's sake.
I started writing as an MA student on a media course, and I was very interested in the reasons why, although people talked about pornography and sexually explicit media as being a big problem, my subject area didn't seem to be studying it in any great detail.
Did the people who I read early on influence my work? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. Not necessarily in concrete and identifiable ways, but William Faulkner, for example, was interested in exploring how you write somebody's voice in a way that represents how they are feeling, and that is certainly something I tried to do with my novel Poker Face and then my novel The Pleasure Dome.
In a sense, I think I'm more influenced by individual poems than poets themselves, although I could certainly list a number of poets who are very important to me. Let's say Thomas Hardy, Emily Dickinson, Carol Ann Duffy, but apart from that, it's sort of individual poems by individual poets that resonate, that you keep in your head and are always there for you. It's very difficult to know how much influence something has. You know that you like it, you know you admire it. You might pick a poem by Wilfred Owen, you might pick a poem by, there's a black American poet writing in the 30s called Robert Hayden. There's one particular poem of his which I absolutely adore, and it's hard to know what you've got from it, how it's influenced you exactly, except that it's somehow sunk into your subconscious and is a benchmark against which you write.
It's hard for me to say who actually influenced my style, because I'm not totally sure what my style is or how other people would define it. I can tell you some of the authors I was most enamoured of when I was quite young. Patrick White, E.M. Forster, Iris Murdoch, Kingsley Amis a bit later, whose satirical style I enjoyed a lot. These were all authors that made a big impression on me at the time. I've always read poetry, and I knew a lot of poetry by heart when I was quite young. Things like T.S. Eliot and Gerard Manley Hopkins, and some of those cadences still float through my brain to this day.
It's a huge kind of eclectic mix of books that I fell in love with. I wasn't so fond of the kind of classic ones that lots of my friends were. I wasn't a big Jane Austen fan, for example, but I did love Bram Stoker, and I did love, I liked Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte more than Charlotte, so it was kind of mishmash.
When I was younger, the inspiration came from other writers' work. I wasn't really that interested in writing about things around me. I was interested in a writer called Joe Orton, and then I read a biography of him, and I really liked him. I really liked his attitude, and I read some of his other plays which I really liked. And there was other writers, Edward Bond I read around that time, and Howard Barker. I really liked both their approach to character and the language and the daring of those plays, really. They were sort of not like anything I'd see on TV, so it opened up a whole new world to me. And some filmmakers, some people like Louis Buñuel was a huge influence, especially when I started making films. Jean Genet was another big influence on me, both as a filmmaker and as a writer. It's sort of people who take a sort of slightly more poetic approach to things.
There were several books that were very important to me. A book by Walter Kendrick, which was about the history of pornography, which I thought was completely fascinating. And a book by an academic called Jane Juffer, which looked at pornography in a completely different way, in terms of things that were accessible to different kinds of people, and why it might be that women read certain kinds of things and men read certain kinds of things, and what that had to do with the way that shops were set up and ideas about respectability and so on. I think those were the two key things, really, that made me want to study what I study in more detail.
I think everything in life is inspiring, everything in our lives is inspiring. I think a writer is a kind of recycling centre. We take in images and impressions and make them into something new, turn them into something new. I began writing or thinking about Sancti Clandestini when I discovered that there was a patron saint of disappointing children. I then went and did some research and found out there were patron saints of lumberjacks and all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect. And then I thought, I wonder what kinds of things there weren't any patron saints for, and that's what really kicked me off. So it was trying to come at things slant-wise, from a different angle.
With a more recent play I wrote called Coward, two of the characters are based on real people, so I researched their lives and researched their attitudes and tried to find out how they spoke. The other character is a fictional character, but he was developed maybe a bit slower than characters like the ones in Fat Souls, because he, in a way, was an aspect of the other two characters, and I had to abstract him from them and find him that way.
When you start looking into the material that's already been written about friendship, it dates back to Aristotle. Some of it is extremely complicated and challenging. And to do the subject justice, it was obviously very important to read very widely. And I also realised that it was going to be very important to read across disciplines. I had papers and post-it notes and index cards strewn around. I started drawing maps and sticking them up on the wall. I think it was probably a slightly alarming place for other people to see, but for me it was about allowing these various different things which appeared to not necessarily have, each thing appeared unconnected to the other thing.
I'll get a kind of very, very long, very detailed list of places, items, collections that I think I need. And obviously this grows because as I start work on the book, I find new things, I find more things, and it's ever growing.
I had to do quite a bit of research along the way, although that makes it sound much more virtuous than it was. Research for fiction is often a very ad hoc kind of procedure, and you find out a bit here, a bit there. Something just falls into your lap sometimes, which turns out to be very useful.
For Westworld, I began first of all with the letters, and there were lots of letters in Tulsa in America. So the first thing I did was I spent quite a lot of money and sent a very detailed list to the Beinecke and said, can I please have copies of all these letters? And they arrived in 3 huge boxes, which I then had to catalogue and work through. So I need enough primary information for me to be able to tell a story.
Once you start down that road of researching things, you start getting obsessive about it. And so was it worth taking it out? Yes, it is. Do I think every single detail in a historical novel needs to be accurate? No, because you're not writing history, you're writing a story. But nonetheless, you try and get it as accurate as you can.
The first book that I edited was called Mainstreaming Sex, and actually it was really easy to select work for that because so few people were writing about it in an interesting way. So I basically asked all of them and they all contributed a chapter. I think the particular problem that researchers are facing at the moment, it's not that we can't necessarily get hold of materials, it's that the context about what is acceptable and unacceptable for people to look at changes. Although people talked about pornography and sexually explicit media as being a big problem, my subject area didn't seem to be studying it in any great detail, and that was partly what was behind my kind of interest and the way that my research developed, really.
With Ali Pali Prison Camp, I thought that these poems would be 1 or 2 poems that would go into my next collection. I started reading one book, that led me to another book, that led me to the Imperial War Museum, where I read every book that I could find in the British Library that was connected with this. And from that I distilled the tiny little bits of memoir, bits of letters that have gone into the book, so that it's a collage of the voices and pictures that I could find that relate to that event.
Somebody once said that if every author made a list of the 8 most significant people in their life, that would in fact be a list of your characters.
If I write about characters who do appear to be marginalised for one reason or the other, it's because that particular character has interested me. When I write, I often feel the characters in a way. I feel what it's physically like to be them, and that voice comes from that physical state. So there is a sort of quality of mediumship about it. Some characters are purely imagined, so they will come to me through the world of the story. So some characters appear fully formed, so they're there and they're speaking and I know them very, very immediately. Some characters take a bit more time. For example, in Fat Souls, a play I wrote, it's quite a long while ago now, in the early 1990s, the characters arrived pretty much fully formed.
And the characters actually grew as I wrote them. So it was the act of writing that developed the characters of these weird and wonderful saints. I think one of the things that you want to do as a writer, as well as expressing your own thoughts, is to give voice to people who perhaps don't have a voice of their own.
The actual people that I picked because they were women I admired and I felt deserved more exposure, more publicity than they currently had. I thought they had incredible lives.
Poverty, I think, is, well, it's something I can't help but write about because the economic situation that someone is in so clearly shapes their life.
All sorts of themes began to emerge as I looked around the post-it notes and index cards that were strewn around my office, and so then I decided to do it thematically. So maybe beginnings was one of the themes. Endings, of course, was another theme. What is going to happen to friendship in the future? How do politicians approach friendship? Where will it lead us? Where can it take us? What are the possibilities?
How one gets a style, I don't really know. I think it just comes from doing a lot of reading and liking certain things and trying to do them and probably not getting them quite right, but then coming up with something else. I was always writing novels which are in this kind of style, which is a sort of, I don't even know if you'd call it realism, it's a sort of stylized story, but which is nonetheless set in the real world. And so I was never really thinking, oh, now I'm writing in this genre, now I'm writing in that genre. It's just the way things turned out. Alfred Hitchcock said once that that what you had to do in making a film was to take that blank screen and fill it with emotion. I've always liked that. I think that's a great way of talking about what a feature film certainly is supposed to do. It is supposed to create emotion. If you're not creating emotion in a reader, then you're not doing your job properly as a writer. You are supposed to be emotive. That's what I mean. Yes, a story should have thoughts in it. It should make you think. But a novel is ultimately an engine to generate feeling. That is what it is there for.
I use masks in Fat Souls because it seemed to me that those characters were hiding behind something. In a metaphorical sense, so I literalised that by having them hiding behind these masks. So it's a very simple device, and the audience rather liked it, were fascinated by it, I think, as well.
When I write, I was advised early on to have in mind a kindly aunt as an audience.
I don't think it's a good idea to write with a specific audience in mind?
I don't think I do have a kindly aunt in mind as an audience. I might imagine some kind of hazy, slightly distant relative of whom I am fond and with whom I want to communicate. So it's not a specific audience. It's certainly not, you know, young adult readers or horror readers, but it is somebody with whom I want to communicate, for whom I feel affection.
I don't write just for myself. I do hope that there will be people at the other end who read it. I really want that to happen, but I can't sit there with this sort of imaginary reader in front of me trying to predict in advance all of their responses to everything that I'm putting down. You have to write a story which entertains you, which is about what you want to write about, and then you hope that it connects with other people.
I don't think I write with any audience in mind. I simply write because writing is a sort of drive, a sort of hunger, a sort of need that you have to fulfill, and I don't think I write with any particular audience in mind.
I don't really have an audience as such, but I'm aware obviously that people who like biographies, I hope, will enjoy mine. I was also quite keen that people who had read, for example, the work of Rebecca West would want to know more about her, would want to know something about the kind of dichotomies and the confusion that made this incredibly talented woman write the way she wrote.
I have to say that I find a lot of academic writing really, really hard to read, and I think that there has often been this kind of encouragement that the more difficult you make it, that somehow the better it is. I try to write very simply, so I am trying to make my writing as conversational as possible, but also be completely certain that it is actually based on evidence. It's not just me sort of trying to be clever.
In life, what challenges me most as a writer is time and headspace, time to think, time for the words kind of bubble to the surface, and they need time to do that, and that's not always easy to find.
Coming up with new ideas that don't repeat what I've already done is quite challenging. Pushing myself to do something new and take my explorations somewhere else that I haven't particularly been before.
When I was quite young and I first started trying to write novels, I didn't have very much patience. I would sit all day trying to write, and have just written one paragraph, and I would be in despair thinking, if I can only write this much in one day, how am I ever going to write an entire book? The biggest challenges in writing is simply to keep on doing it. There is always something else you can be doing. You have to develop a very strong sort of ethic of work if you're going to write a novel. It's a hard thing to do. It is a hard thing to do because you can't write a novel in a burst of inspiration. You have to stick with it through months and years while it slowly develops, it slowly comes together. It's more like doing a jigsaw puzzle in many ways, rather than just, you know, sort of expressing your feelings, as people always think. It's not about that. It's about putting together a quite long and complex narrative.
For me, the big challenge is all about presenting things in an accessible way. That's the thing that I kind of worry about most, and would be most pleased about if I can crack the problem of writing accessibly about complicated subjects.
First, I thought I just couldn't do it at all. It just seemed an impossible task. How was I going to write a story which would largely be set in early 20th century America with scenes in pre-war Japan and so forth? It just seemed like this immense research task which you'd never get to the end of. It seemed absolutely impossible.
When I did start to write the Book of Friendship, I think I was under the illusion that it may be fairly straightforward. It was, I think, probably the most challenging thing I've ever done. It was a massive remit, and then of course the other challenge was condensing that into a book.
And that's half the battle. You got the story, but now you've got to say, well, how am I going to tell this story? And then coming up with places I haven't been to before.
All the writing that we do, we want to set ourselves a new creative challenge. it would be boring to do the same thing over and over again. So you hope that you're going to be able to find something new to do.